attending today's webinar, which we'll be talking about cybersecurity baselines for electric distribution utilities and distributed energy resources. My name is Lynn Costantini. I am the Deputy Director for the Center for Partnerships and Innovation at NARUC. CPI is the technical assistance arm of NARUC, and we provide resources, training and education, and opportunities for peers to get together and learn from each other and from other experts that NARUC is able to bring into the conversation. We work across a number of relevant regulatory topic areas. Cybersecurity, of course, is just one of them. So I come to NARUC, I've been here for about 5 years. My background is the Board of Public Utilities in the state of New Jersey. I was there for about 3 years, where I wrote cybersecurity requirements for the state. Before the BPU, I was a member of the NERC staff, where I was a member of the first 2 drafting teams for the NERC SIP standards. So I bring a lot of that background into the discussion today. Before we begin, though, I did want to mention some housekeeping issues. This is a webinar. All of our audience participants are in muted mode. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A function built in to the webinar platform or enter your question in the chat function. And with that, I would like to introduce, go to the next slide, if you will. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Joe Quinn from the Department of Energy. Department of Energy was a key partner with NARUC in developing these cybersecurity baselines. Joe, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, Lynn. Thanks, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Joe Quinn. I'm a senior policy advisor in DOE's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, which we call in a friendly way DOE CSER. Before that, I was in the utility sector for over 12 years. I have experience as an access management, NERC SIP SME, as well as some experience doing some regulatory work as an attorney. DOE is happy to partner with this funded effort with NARUC to try to come up with exactly the guidance that we're going to start talking about for the next hour or so. We have all the whys planned in the following materials, but we wanted to start with just like a general look and take a step back to talk about the threat that we're all facing as we protect critical infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. So the 2024 Worldwide Threat Assessment was just released and identified 3 nation states and another group that folks are always familiar with, but it's always just a good way to reset these conversations with, when we talk about why now, when we talk about why we're trying to develop all these tools, technologies, and mitigation strategies, we have constant reassurance and evaluation that's going on across the sector in terms of what our threat is and where it's coming from. So as you can see, China, Russia, Iran, and transnational cyber criminals have been identified in the Worldwide Threat Assessment as potentially or as a risk to critical infrastructure. But the conversation, like that document, might be for folks in the know, folks who are working in national security, folks who are in their security organizations. But cybersecurity, as you are all aware, has bled into the regular press too. And these are just some recent examples of cybersecurity attacks or cybersecurity headlines that have made it into major news publications that are not only getting the attention of people that work in security on a day-to-day basis, but also maybe in C-suites, maybe in your press, maybe in your constituencies. Just another way to really frame the conversation and highlight that cybersecurity is becoming more and more of an issue that everybody has an interest in. And as the folks in and around critical infrastructure that are working to protect us on a day-to-day basis, you know this well, but again, we just like to frame it this way when we start the conversation today.
Thanks, Joe. And I do think it's important to kind of set the stage with which we began the work to develop these cybersecurity baselines. But I think the real call to action, at least for the Public Utility Commission community, came in March of 2022. And that's when the White House issued a letter to every state governor with some very pointed questions about cybersecurity for critical infrastructure within individual states. And I think these three questions here that you see really are so important as the drivers, if you will, for the action that came later. One of the first questions to the governors were, have you set enforceable cybersecurity baselines for the utilities in your state? And if you have the authority to do so, have you done it? And the next question is, if you haven't, have public utility commissions in your state that have the regulatory authority to create mandatory standards, have they done so? Here's the most important point, I think. If not, ask them to do so. That is a very pointed and explicit call to action. And clearly, the White House was worried that without taking action, the consequences of a cyber attack could have dire results for individual states. They specifically asked if states had a cybersecurity incident response plan. And they're also talking about the physical consequences of a cybersecurity attack. So that, again, coupled with that clarion call to take action, the reason that they want action taken is to prevent those dire physical consequences. But that is not the only call to action that we were listening to. Joe, why don't you talk about the other one?
Sure. So on the last slide, Lynn talks about that letter that goes out in March of 2022. Over a year later, actually, it's less than a year later. Sorry, I got my dates mixed. March 2023, the president releases the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And while the strategy has this whole language in there about rebalancing the need to defend cyberspace and aligning incentives to build cybersecurity into growth in all critical infrastructure sector, the part that we're particularly felt as the call to action for the development of this effort was in strategic objective 4.4. Where DOE would continue to promote cybersecurity for electric distribution, distributed energy resources, and then in partnership with the partners listed here. That language continued to promote cybersecurity is really the basis for what we've been doing here, because the whole effort here has been an effort to develop a resource to promote cybersecurity for the partners listed here. I'll point out here too, it says industry, states, federal regulators, Congress, and other agencies. Those have pretty much all been included in some way or another in how we've been developing this effort. But the inclusion of Congress here, people always ask, well, one of the reasons we're having this webinar now is because of a recent publication of the Phase 1 baselines document, which we'll talk about in a second. But the inclusion of Congress here isn't in any way to amend existing law. It was always in a way to maybe authorize and pursue funding opportunities for private sector with this whole theme of promoting cybersecurity with the existing jurisdiction that we have in our sector. So again, this isn't an opportunity to say, like, are they going to amend the Federal Power Act? That's not what anybody here is talking about. So just wanted to highlight that here. But again, another call to action in the president's national cybersecurity strategy. This effort is to promote cybersecurity with the stakeholders listed here.
So given the president's letter to governors, given the national cybersecurity strategy, given those very pointed calls to action, both for state public utility commissions and for DOE, NARUC and DOE decided to partner on a project that would address both of the calls to action that had been provided. So that is when the Cybersecurity Baselines for Electric Distribution Systems and DER was born. And we as the project team went into scoping the project with some very specific goals in mind. We wanted to, as Joe said, promote cybersecurity for electric distribution utilities and DER. We wanted to produce a set of comprehensive cybersecurity baselines for electric distribution utilities, including considerations for interconnected distributed energy resources. So we realized that we did not want these baselines to apply to, for example, a homeowner's solar array, but for the kind of DER assets that were actually interconnecting to the distribution system and could influence the safety and reliability of the distribution system. And going a step further, the distribution system that can influence the safety and reliability of the bulk power system. So what we wanted to avoid with our comprehensive cybersecurity baselines was the patchwork quilt of potential cybersecurity actions that states could take in response to that president's letter. A patchwork quilt of requirements around cybersecurity for distribution utilities would be really ineffective. It would be an inefficient use of resources. And it also raised the prospect of the potential for cybersecurity requirements across different states to be in conflict with each other. Again, not a very effective approach to cybersecurity. And lastly, we wanted to provide a foundation upon which to build. We're setting the baseline, not the ceiling. So this project already builds in an assumption that once we get a foundation in place, we have something to build from to get closer to the ceiling, if you will. Next slide, please. And not only did we go in with those very clear goals and purpose, we also went into the project with some very clear principles around the way that we would accomplish those goals. And first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that the baselines we created were outcome-oriented, risk-informed, and really importantly, leverage the existing body of work that has already been created. We did not want to start from a blank piece of paper. There was no reason to. And the baselines themselves are recommendations. They are non-binding on any state to adopt. Of course, if states want to lean in and adopt cybersecurity requirements for their distribution systems, we encourage the baselines that we created to be those that they adopt. The other thing we went into this project realizing is that we needed to split up the amount of work that was really required to produce those cybersecurity baselines, but not just create the baselines, those control statements, if you will, but we also recognized that we needed implementation guidance to accompany the baselines. So for states and other stakeholders that really wanted to embrace these requirements and implement these requirements, we needed some implementation guidance to help them do just that. And lastly, NARUC and DOE committed to making available lots of opportunities for its members and other interested stakeholders to learn about the project, to learn about the baselines that we actually developed, and to participate in that second phase of the project, which is to develop that implementation guidance. So Joe's going to take over from here and talk about the baselines themselves that were created as part of the phase 1 activity.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, as Lynn said too, this is just all that lead-in is just a good way to contextualize the conversation to say that this is somewhere in the middle of from where we started and where this is going to end. But in terms of what the steering group and the group of stakeholders that contributed to this effort, it's a significant milestone in having this document, 1, developed and 2, published. So I just want to spend some time talking through that and then give some examples. We've used language like tailored to the electric sector or implementation guidance. Like, what are we talking about when we say those things? So the screenshot here is actually the cover page of the baselines document. It's cybersecurity baselines for electric distribution systems and DER. When we say the longer version of that, we say and the DER that connect to them to kind of contextualize what part of that sector we're talking about. But this was work that began in March of 2023, and the document was published February 22nd of 2024. So it takes almost a year to come up with what's the four corners document that has this language that we'd call our cybersecurity baselines. And Lynn and I have been talking a lot on this webinar. There's also some folks who are added here as panelists on this webinar. But Lynn and I are representatives of the steering group that really put in the work to develop these. And in any way, anytime you get together a group of really talented people from across our sector, we always agree right away. There's no major, stalls in the process. Nobody has a better idea than anybody else, and it's a really easy conversation. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek because obviously this is very challenging. It's challenging work to come up with language that people agree to that doesn't get people too narrowly focused on one specific part of what the text is intended to say, while also making it broad enough to allow for risk-based control that kind of the sector's uh, security controls have been built on for, frankly, the last decade and more. So what the steering group did is really help challenge each other to come up with language that represented baseline controls. The other thing too, like originally we started with different strawman versions of the document. We finally settled on using the CISA cybersecurity performance goals as the text that we were going to anchor to and then edit and then do the tailoring we've been talking about. I'll show you some examples in the next couple of slides of what that specifically means. But just as a quick check here, the CPGs were the basis for what we've published here. And the document is mapped to these and some others as informative references. Again, another concept we'll talk through in a little bit. And then it's tailored for electricity and distribute or DER that connect to them, but the implementation guidance is really where we're going to do kind of thread out even more of what that tailoring actually is. Because if utility commissions, if utilities, if other organizations are going to use this document, what are considerations they need to take into place? And when they're presenting that they're using this document, what are other folks who are aware of the folks, that relationship to this document? What do they need to be aware of in terms of how it was developed and how it was implemented? All those considerations are really important to say that, when we talk about the phase two effort, not everything everywhere, but like the tailoring is really critical. Okay. When we started phase one, the goals were we all know that our sector is highly regulated. There's a lot in place, not in terms of just incident reporting, not just in terms of the federal government, but also at the states. There's a lot going on that our sector has developed a compliance culture. Our sector already has a safety culture, and we're certainly building on our cybersecurity culture. We wanted to leverage those practices, mandatory or voluntary, and make sure that they were captured in this document so that people weren't dealing with not only a patchwork quote at the state level, but also just this thing that they'd have to sort through in terms of their own compliance programs of what they were dealing with when, what resources they were leveraging where, that kind of a thing. Um, uh, I referenced this a little bit before, but the committee went through multiple versions of what this document looked like. We finally settled on the CISA CPGs and then tailored it. And as I mentioned before, published in February of 22. And I think I saw the link pop into the chat, but I was doing some screen dancing. So yeah, it's in there. And again, afterwards, we're going to be sending this material so people have access to it. Okay. In terms of what's in that document, here's the list of the quote baselines that are there. And something that hasn't been said, but is probably just good to highlight again for additional context, the phrase baselines was chosen because it's somewhere between best practices and requirements. And whether requirements are mandatory or not, that's aside. But it was just this goal that like this was something that there was some kind of, push to get it a little bit between the two of those. But here's a list from the table of contents from the document that identifies this baselines. We kept the same titles and numbering schematic as the CISA CPGs. One, because we thought that they were the controls we were talking about. In some cases, we combine them, and we'll actually show you an example of those. But then this will certainly help with the informative references when we talk about that later. But also the CISA CPGs are mapped to the NIST CSF, or the version 1 of the CSF, the Identify, Protect, Detect, Respond, Recover. And when you actually get into the document, the numbering schematic 1 through 5 aligns to those parts of the control. Okay. Here is a version formatted for this conversation to show what we talk about when we're talking about tailoring the baseline or the CISA CPGs to our sector. This is on 1A asset inventory. So I'll explain the format of what you're looking at, and then we'll talk about what's actually in the text here. Name and numbering schematic 1A asset inventory, that comes from the CISA CPGs. The column that's labeled distribution and DER baseline, that's the text that this steering group came up with. The original text in the recommended action text of the CISA CPGs is all the way on the right. So original text right, final product is here. What's published in the document on the NARUC website is what's listed in distribution DER baseline. This is a case where we did not combine anything. We just edited the text to make it 1A. Scope of your assets is critical, and we wanted to make sure to have this conversation with the steering group in a way to get all the words correct here. So I'll just read and then point out some things in a step-by-step way. Maintain an inventory of critical IT and OT assets using the organization's risk-based criteria. One of the key things that we heard through the steering group is that we wanted to leverage risk-based criteria, risk-based controls, risk-based assessments, because that's the way that the sector has been doing it for as long as we've been dealing with cybersecurity and even further back. What that changed from here was maintain a regularly updated inventory of all organizational assets with an IP address. So in terms of like the scope of the type of assets we're talking about, we listed it as critical IT and digital OT using a risk-based criteria. So that scopes it. I'm going to flip to the CISA language to point out something else here. The inventory is updated on a recurring basis, no less than monthly for both IT and OT. The steering group thought that this was too prescriptive and that the document didn't allow for already existing controls that were in place at their facilities and throughout the sector. And rather than describe it in a way that was to do this monthly, this is where this risk-based criteria comes in. So let's leverage, one of our themes from the beginning, let's leverage what we're already doing in the sector rather than try to confine ourselves to some new language or some new time cadence. The other key one here, back to scope, was that it was for classifying the criticality of assets that are, scoping it again, essential to the delivery of energy. This is phrasing we see in other regulations or frameworks, mandatory and voluntary, in the sector. And we thought it reflected better what an asset inventory was supposed to do for critical infrastructure rather than just this, the use of the word all. And anybody who works in compliance or regulatory, has some of that function in their day-to-day work knows that the word all is terrifying. And the steering group worked very hard to make sure that instead of saying that, we didn't just not say all, we scoped the type of assets we're talking about. So it's critical IT and digital OT using a risk-based criteria to define criticality, but only for those that are essential to delivery of energy. And as you can imagine, this conversation was like 30 minutes on one day. It didn't take the whole length of the effort. Again, just a tongue-in-cheek comment to say like the text here was really critical, and just hats off to the steering group for coming up with language that makes this work. When we talk about phase 2 on the asset inventory, the thing that's not listed here, so you guys may be going like, okay, good, you got the words right. So what do I do with this? We have to consider all of the owner operators and DER folks in the sector. Not everybody might be able to do an asset inventory. This might not be the most critical thing that everybody has to come up with. What the next phase of this, the implementation guidance, is all about is contextualizing that conversation and then providing guidance for all the stakeholders in the sector to understand why, when, if so, how, those kinds of things. So great, we got the words right if you were going to do this, but then we have to talk about if you're going to do this. Okay. A couple of the other ones, again, kind of using our theme of leveraging the work that's in the sector that folks are aware of too, is supply chain. This is an example where, going back to the format that we're presenting this with today, an example where we combine two of the CPGs. So 1G and 1H are separate ones in terms of what's in the CISA document, but for ours, we thought we needed to make them combined because the processes were so similar. But frankly, it's because we thought the text was too prescriptive, talking about what needs to be in SLAs, stipulating that vendors and service providers notify the procuring customer. All of this may be language that the folks who use this document end up with, or maybe processes that exist. Um, but again, we put things in here like make a good faith effort to negotiate procurement documents within a risk informed timeline. But really, here, the implementation guidance is going to be critical because many of you are aware there's already been a lot of great work in the sector on supply chain and on vendor engagement, particularly like NETF has an effort on cybersecurity questionnaire that's been developed over the last couple of years. We wanted to allow space for things like that, where people are trying to get ahead of how this interaction should occur, could be leveraged in a voluntary way if necessary. So that's just another example on supply chain where we think we've talked through what the tailoring might look like. Okay, same cases here, but really just another way to call out that there were three on supply chain. Um, Again, our language is intentionally more broad than the original recommended action text. Like in this one in particular, like in terms of what this was primarily here to talk about some of the things we have to talk about in phase two, but the original text had include cybersecurity requirements and questions, but then given that there are two offerings of roughly similar costs and function, that you chose the more secure offering. That kind of phrasing isn't the way we made decisions historically in the energy sector. We've used the risk based process, or we evaluate responses as part of a broader risk based conversation. But just to highlight some of the changes we've made with the language as identified in the original version. And I heard a microphone come off mute. Did somebody have anything to add there? Okay. Okay, and when you receive the materials, please feel free to look, please feel free to compare. There's a conversation on informative references / mapping that's currently in draft phase that we'll get to in a moment, but just thought it was important to highlight for the audience today that what the tailoring meant in terms of what's in the baseline text. And Lynn, I will turn it back to you to phase two.
Thanks, Joe. So that's a little background into the baselines themselves, where we started and where we ended. And Joe was being tongue-in-cheek when he said these conversations were easy when we were talking with the steering group about how to tailor those CISA requirements. But I think because we went through iterative processes with the steering group itself, and then also external review and comment, we have really come up with that set of baselines that is very, very useful and serves the purpose and goals that we started out with. But as I noted in the very beginning, developing the baselines themselves were only half the challenge. The other was to develop guidelines, implementation guidance for those stakeholders who chose to embrace these baselines and implement them in practice. And that is going to be equally challenging, I think, as developing the baselines, developing the implementation guidance. So work is set to begin on phase two in April of this year. It once again will be a steering group driven process. However, we are looking to add more technical and policy expertise to the steering group just to make sure that we have an ample representation of stakeholder perspectives at the table. And the implementation guidance will be comprehensive and it will be inclusive. So we're not just writing cybersecurity implementation guidance for public utility commissions. We recognize there are other stakeholders that might also be interested in embracing these baselines, bringing these into their organizations. So the implementation guidance will consider all stakeholders. If you want to go to the next slide. And here's a list of some of the key topics that we will be working on when we start the implementation guidance development phase. One is scoping the assets to which these cyber baselines will apply. Not every asset that a utility owns and operates is critical to providing that reliable delivery of energy. And that's kind of the first criteria, that the asset must be critical in providing reliable service. But we also know not every asset is created equal in the provision of reliable energy service. So not only scoping what assets should be included, but tiering those assets. The second key bucket of work is to prioritize the baselines themselves. I think Joe used the phrase, not everything everywhere all at once. This is another area of work where we think we can help people that do want to implement these baselines do it in a way that makes sense. And the most important baselines are implemented first. So we look at this challenge in a question in this format. If you had only $1 to spend on cybersecurity, where would you spend it first? So that's what we're talking about when we say prioritizing the baselines. And then, of course, another key area of work is specifically directed at public utility commissions. If commissions want to lean in, if they want to adopt these cybersecurity baselines as requirements within their state, what would they need within their commission to be able to do that and do it well? Distributed energy resources and the baselines that apply to them, maybe through interconnection agreements, that will be the key topic of conversation in that area of work. And then lastly, and I think very importantly, is the work that we have already begun, but we will complete in phase 2. And that is mapping these baselines to other existing standards, frameworks, and best practices that we see across the energy sector. And if you go to the next slide, Joe, we'll take a look at what the draft looks like. This draft was published along with the baselines themselves. This is a draft of the mappings. These have not been thoroughly vetted. That will be a task of phase 2, to vet these and add others that are applicable and appropriate. There's 2 reasons to do this. One, I think it contextualizes our baseline statement, the control statement itself, across all of the other guidance that's available for utilities. But it also serves another purpose. In the end, if a public utility does want to implement these as requirements, having this mapping will help understand if you meet one requirement, you've also met the requirement for the cybersecurity baseline. So again, this work will continue. It is not complete. If you have specific suggestions for requirements, frameworks, standards, best practices that we should look at and be including in this table, please let Joe or myself know. And I think that is the end of the formal presentation. And as I said, we will be taking Q&A. Please use the Q&A function built in to the webinar platform, or you can also use the chat function. I would like to introduce some other speakers that we have on our call today. These are folks who actually are members of the steering group, and they have volunteered to help us answer some of your questions. So with that, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. And the first one is, to what extent did parties drafting the baselines express concern about these guidelines being a barrier to DER development? Does anybody want to take the first stab at that?
I will, Lynn.
Sure.
Oh.
No, please go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, hi. Richard Morose. I was the chairman of the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, chairman of NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee, now also advisor now to a group called Protect Our Power, and an independent consultant, part of the working group. And there was discussion about not so much that the working group thought it would be a barrier, but it would be perceived as that, perceived as a barrier, perceived as the working group in some fashion suggesting that DER deployment should be slowed or otherwise managed much more aggressively. Though I would say across the group, which was industry, including distribution companies, regulators, former regulators, consultants, academics, the desire to have these baselines implemented was paramount, to focus on the need to secure the distribution systems and the DER, and that there should be, in sessions like this, a clear articulation of exactly that goal. And even though, yes, it will impact the DER community, the developers particularly, that are implementing grid edge systems, I think there was unanimity amongst the working group that this needs to be done. And even though it might be perceived that way, that is not the intention by any means. And I would also say, in the work that I've done over the years, there's a recognition in the DER development community that they too very much need to be part of a solution to make sure that we secure the grid. So even though there was a recognition that this might be a perception, that was not by any means an intention, but there was a recognition that we need to articulate the goals of the effort and the ultimate recommendations of the working group.
And I will add to that, Rick, thank you so much. We did have DER experts on the steering group, so we weren't making decisions on their behalf. The next question comes from Steve Loftus. He is asking if there is a mechanism to externally validate compliance with these standards. And I think I'll take a first shot at that. First of all, these are not standards. These are baseline recommendations. And I think the idea of compliance with these baselines will be something that is addressed in phase 2 as we discuss the regulatory mechanisms and the PUC approaches to actually implementing these standards. So I do think that is part and parcel of the phase 2 conversation on that topic. And if that does not answer your question, please let me know. Thank you. Another question, it's for NARUC. Will NARUC consider hosting a webpage that shows states and commissions that are actively considering implementing these baselines? That's an excellent suggestion. We're actually working on something right now, an interactive map that shows the requirements states already have in place. For example, a number of states do have cybersecurity incident reporting requirements, and we're working to collect those and display on an interactive map. So I think that's a very good suggestion, and we will work to implement that. Thank you so much for that. And Joe, perhaps this is a question that you can answer again from Steve Loftus. Given the stated goals in making the standards approachable, would the CIS standards be a better fit than NIST?
Yeah, sure. So I think that um, the way we started this was to get to the CPGs, which are NIST based, and then all this, was because they were the most accessible. Stephen, this point didn't come up about it being a better fit in terms of making it more approachable. I think the goal, we wanted them to be like we wanted the sector to be familiar with them, but approachable to an outside third party. We thought the implementation guidance that would contextualize how these things can be used, like that's where that comes up. But I I might actually appreciate a follow up with you because you have a couple questions, um, just to understand exactly your perspective on this. So, original question is: would CIS standards be a better fit for the stated goals rather than the NIST-based standards? Um, we can leverage more existing controls if we use something that was NIST based because that's the majority of how the sector has functioned. But Stephen, I'd be happy to talk to you about the CIS one.
And we can certainly map the CIS standards in our mapping table. And again, Steve has a follow-on question about the concern or potential concern about reducing the number of assets that must comply with creating additional attack paths through those non-critical assets. I don't think that's what we are considering in that topical area of work that we're going to be undertaking during phase 2. I think what we are going to do is be discussing among the steering group and the expertise within the steering group for how we might articulate different tiers of assets and which assets are first and foremost to be secured, if you will, using these baseline controls. I don't think we're suggesting that we wouldn't recommend all assets be secured, but I think it's the manner in which they're secured that might differ. And Joe, please contribute.
No. And Shari has a hand up from the steering group, Lynn.
Yeah, I think Lynn, I think you hit on some of it. It's critical when you're designing something like this that you have to focus on a risk-based approach. So it wasn't to exclude assets or eliminate assets as, quote, non-critical for protection, but rather how do you prioritize your resources, triage, and take a phased approach based on the most critical risks so that the entities that might have to ultimately comply with something these standards get converted to, and or who voluntarily comply with frameworks and standards like these, can have a path to getting there, versus where we're at right now, which is a lot of folks that are completely overwhelmed and a bit in chaos and don't even know where to point resources to, so are somewhat paralyzed.
Thank you for that, Shari. Does anybody else have anything to add to that before we go to the next one? The next question is somewhat technical, Joe. And if you want to take this, it's with respect to a specific baseline.
Sure. So it's asking about disable macros by default. From what I can tell you, the conversations we had around the fourth version of the document, there was a long part on the second day of an in-person meeting about this one specifically. It went back and forth a ton. It was designed to include both. I understand that it's a little confusing, but it was broadened intentionally to make sure that software could be used. But I will take this back to the steering group specifically. I just wanted to be, I wanted to answer the question directly, but Jim, are you on this one?
Yeah, I was on this, and one of the important things is I believe CISA came out with hey, there's been a lot of Word and Excel macros that have been compromising people. So when you put in your system start with the default of turning your macros off. So it was in response to real world attacks going on that this kind of made it into the system. Now, when you install Office 365, you can disable the macros, and then it can prompt you to say, hey, do you trust this person, and let it roll. So that was in response to actual attacks that had been successful.
Thank you. But to the commenter, we're going to take that back to the team. Thank you.
And before we close today, we will give you some information as to how you can ask additional questions of the steering group. So let's hold that in abeyance. Here's a question that I think is very relevant, especially when we're thinking about phase 2 work. For the utilities that do have and have been working for years on developing robust cybersecurity programs, will these baselines take resources away, or will they diminish the good work that's already been done? And I think you have specifically, the person that raised this question has specifically captured the intent of our mapping. We do want to give credit for work that has already taken place. We don't want people to divert resources to do something different. That is why we worked so hard in the beginning to really assess all of the body of work that had come before this effort. The standards, the NERC CIP standards, for example, the frameworks, the NIST CSF, 62443, to really understand what was out there and not to create a control statement that was in direct conflict with any of that. And I think that's where the mapping document comes in, and we will continue to extend that mapping document to capture all of that good work. Joe, would you like to contribute?
No, well said. It came up the first day we started talking about it. It came up every day in between. Like, this is absolutely part of it. Is we're not making this overly burdensome in a way that impacts day-to-day security. It's something that we have to continue to hold close to heart, kind of is throughout the entire phase 2 effort, because if it ends up there, when you talk about implementation guidance, like what value is that if it's not going to recognize, like, leverage existing best practices, controls, etc. That's key to anything that we're going to do to be successful here.
Thank you, Joe. And we have a couple more questions. One's very specific to Texas, from a utility from Texas. And they're asking if we have SMEs from the Texas Public Utility Commission on our phase 2 steering group. The answer is yes. We also had SMEs from Texas PUC on phase 1 steering group. And do you want to take the next question, Joe? Sure.
It looks like Jim had a comment on the
just a quick comment on Texas, that there are a lot of people from restructured states that don't regulate the generation. I'm in Illinois and we don't regulate generation. So this is one of those great opportunities for them to follow these standards because they're good. Not because somebody has told them they have to.
Shari, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Yes, just really quickly, I was going to add, because of the 3-part question there, which raises a more general thought on regulatory landscape, whether deregulated or not, and legal risk. So not to take us too far off, but just keep in mind that as Lynn mentioned at the front end, we're trying to get ahead of that patchwork and mitigate that patchwork landscape. The legal, regulatory, non-regulatory legal risk landscape is about to I hate using the word explode, but explode, and go all over the place. And standards like this are going to be the thing that you want to lean into to answer to all those other legal risks. So Lynn, at some point we can take offline. Maybe it'd be worth having a little more of that discussion with folks to help them better understand the value proposition of some of these. But for now, I wanted to plant that and make clear that I wouldn't get too far into the weeds of how I'm regulated and the specifics of my regulatory environment, because it's going to come from every direction.
Thank you for that, Shari. And I think we have just one more question in the queue, Joe, if you want to take that.
Sure. So the question's about whether we can consider IEEE 1547.3 DER standards for cybersecurity, whether they were included in the separate as all. We had some folks who contributed to the drafting of those standards participate in the steering group. And in that informative references or the mapping document that's published on the NARUC website under phase 2, the same place the other thing is, the draft mapping is mapped to IEEE as well. So long answer to wait is to say yes.
Yeah, 1547 standards were referenced quite often by the steering group. And we delved very deeply into understanding what work was being done around 1547 cybersecurity requirements. So thank you for that question. Okay, I think that concludes the Q&A portion of this webinar. Thank you all for your very thoughtful questions. But I'd like now to just leave you with a couple of things. So as I said about phase 2, we are looking to add additional technical and policy expertise to the steering group so we can work on each of those key topical areas, those 5 key topical areas we walked through. If you are interested in participating in phase 2, I just posted a link to, I'll call it an application, but it's really more of a form that you can use to express interest in joining the steering group and which of those key phase 2 topical areas you might be willing to help us explore in more detail. Besides the form on NARUC's website, you can also email cyberbaselines@naruc.org. So you can use that mailbox to send additional questions to the steering group, to the project team, Joe and myself, or you can submit your interest in joining phase 2 by emailing that mailbox. Joe, did you have anything?
No, just if people are thinking of final questions or anything, thanks for coming to hear about this. Thanks to the steering group who helped put this together. We'd be happy to talk to anybody about this, to give another version of this presentation to a different group. So please feel free to watch or reach out. And that'll be the final comments from me, Lynn. Thank you.
And thank you all for participating today. We really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.